Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Thea Keith Lucas. I'm here today with my colleague Trish Weinman, and together we coordinate Radius, a program that supports ethical conversations here at MIT. If you would like captions for today's program, there's a live transcript button with a small CC on it at the bottom of your screen. Please take advantage of that. It's my privilege to welcome our guests for this program, Shailly Gupta Barnes, the Policy Director at the Kairos Center, and Savina Martin, a lifelong activist and the Eastern Chair of the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. We had Shailly and Savina join us in May of 2020 when they gave us a first look at the disparate effect of the pandemic on poor communities. Now, almost a year later, we're beginning to talk about how we can return to what we used to call normal, or whether we can instead take this opportunity to build something new. I can think of no better partners to help us think about wealth, poverty, and the possibilities of this moment. Shailly's, welcome and tell us, what should we be thinking about right now?
Well, thank you, Thea and Trish and everybody at the Radius Center who organized this discussion today. My name is Shailly Gupta Barnes, and I'm the Policy Director of the Kairos Center, as well as the Poor People's Campaign. And Savina, did you want to introduce yourself, and maybe we could share a little bit of what we'll be talking about this afternoon?
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Radius, of course, at MIT, and to my colleague and friend, Shailly Gupta Barnes. My name is Savina Martin, and I serve as one of the tri-chairs here at the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, as well as on the National Clergy Council of the National Union of the Homeless. And thank you for having us back.
So we were going to talk today about how the conditions of this country have changed, mainly for the worse in many ways over the past year, which, it is in some sense a desperate sign, a sign of real crisis. But we also know that out of this crisis, there's also a growing resolve and commitment of the people who are facing these crises to respond to them, to have real, adequate, and just responses from this government, from our economy, from our society as a whole. And I know that in the Poor People's Campaign, that is the power and strength that we draw on to keep pushing for poor and dispossessed and low-income people in this country. So I'm going to share my screen. One second, I do have some slides. So I'm going to talk about these conditions for about 15 minutes or so and how this campaign is organized. We have a short video as well, and then I was going to turn it over to Savina to share some of our upcoming plans for the, what we're calling our 500-day plan. We're already 100 days into them, so it's going to take us to next June of 2022. But we believe that this is the moment to build and organize and to show that, these conditions, it's been far too long that people have been facing these conditions, and it's time to build it's time to move the political will in our direction. So let me just share my screen. One second. Here we go. Okay, can you see that? Okay. So we're here to talk about this growing divide between wealth and poverty, and how enough is enough. And as we talk about the people who are confronting these conditions and coming together in the Poor People's Campaign, and in many other and many other movements and efforts to respond to these conditions, I wanted to share this picture of what this campaign looks like. These are many of the leaders who've been part of the Kairos Center, part of the campaigns network for many years, bringing us to this moment. And they're in every part of the country. In fact, the campaign is organized, as you can see in this map, across 45 states in the country. And in each of these states, we have coordinating committees, we have a defined structure and relationships and responsibilities. And while we are a national campaign, we are rooted in the state-based organizing. That's what these committees are responsible for organizing, for connecting and building relationships from the bottom up. Alongside this network of, New York, alongside this network of state-based campaigns, we also have over 200 national organizations, including religious denominations, labor unions, who've come together in this broad and diverse network to challenge these injustices facing the country. We have three goals. We've always had these three goals of the Poor People's Campaign: to organize and build power among the 140 million people who are poor or low income in the nation, to change the narratives on systemic racism and poverty and ecological devastation and militarism, and the false narrative of Christian nationalism that upholds these injustices. And through that power and through this narrative change, to change policies and election outcomes. And so the basis of everything we do, in fact, comes from this, the basis of the demands we make, the way we organize, the policies we fight for, is based on, this figure of 140 million. This is our assessment of who, before the pandemic, was poor, or one emergency away from being poor, one health crisis, one layoff, one parking ticket, one anything that happens on an everyday basis away from being below the poverty line. And when you put together the number of people who live below the poverty line to the number of people who live right above it, you get 140 million people. That's over 40% of the country. And you can see here on this slide what that looks like in terms of the demographic breakdown, and it's devastating. You could see the impacts of systemic racism and these rates of poverty and economic security among Black, Latino, Native and Asian people, going up to more than 60%, almost 2/3 of Latino and Latina populations. But then you also see alongside that the sheer number of poor white people is nearly as much as the number of people of color who are poor or low income, 66 million on the one hand, and then 74 million on the other. And so our whole theory of change is that these groups must come together to build power and organize against all of these injustices. We have this idea of everybody in, nobody out. And this is this is the basic principle around which this fusion model around which this campaign is organized. And I could say before the pandemic, we were talking about 140 million people, 8 or 10 million people who were homeless or on the verge of homelessness, 50 million people in low-wage work, 14 million families who couldn't afford water, 87 million people for whom, healthcare, who had inadequate or didn't have health insurance. And still, rather than meeting these multiple crises before the pandemic, we were funneling, 53 cents of every discretionary dollar to war and not our human needs. We were spending more money on deportations and prisons and policing than we were on housing and education. And at the same time, we had 3 people in the country have as much wealth as half the country, as half the population. So in fact, all of these conditions have gotten worse in the pandemic. These are both, where the pandemic, they were the conditions that both bred, these are the conditions that bred the basis for the pandemic to wreak its havoc, especially among poor communities of color. But then also they've all gotten worse over the past year. And when we look at, so we'll look at some of that now. We have just in terms of the COVID deaths, this is current through early March. I think that's the latest numbers that I was able to find. You can see the disproportionate impact on Indigenous people in particular, but also on Black and Latino people in terms of the disproportionate number of deaths facing these communities. It's the tragic and devastating consequence of systemic racism and inadequate access to income, to wealth, to health, and more. And so this is a reality that we've had to confront in numerous and multiple and painful ways over and over again this past year. And I also wanted to share alongside this that if we look at the COVID deaths by race and ethnicity, the greatest number of people who have died from COVID-19 have been white. Many of them elderly, many of them poor, but it just shows the importance of looking at race and economic status together alongside each other. And so that's the approach that we take, that we can see early on in the pandemic, there were studies that showed that along with, poverty along with race were the best predictors of who was vulnerable to the pandemic. So we also keep those side by side. And when we look at the economic effects of the pandemic as well, keeping that in mind, this race and, income together, it's clear that, poor and low income families are suffering greater economic security, and even worse among poor families of color, just in terms of disproportionality. What you see here right now shows that, by the end of last year, while high wage jobs had more or less recovered, that's that top line, the pink line, had more or less recovered by the end of the year, only half of low wage jobs had returned. And so, low wage jobs are disproportionately held by people of color. They're disproportionately held by women and women of color. And so you're looking at the conditions that upon which the pandemic was, upon which the pandemic took root, becoming worse over this period. And in fact, Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said last year that the economy, even after it quote unquote recovers, will not be the same. We will not return to the same economy, that many of these low wage workers will not be reabsorbed. They won't have work. And, this is a crisis that this country is not prepared for at all. We're starting to see some expansion of public welfare programs, some inclination to do more with this current administration, but even these steps are very initial and tentative steps in the direction we need to go. And to compound this loss of income is the fact that household expenses have not stopped, right? I mean, we still have to feed ourselves, feed our families, pay some bills, and meet our daily needs. So what this is showing us is how housing debt, in particular among unemployed people, unemployed renters, just grew enormously over the past year. It went from under, around $500 to over $5,000 within a year. And, this is just a snapshot of what's happening to unemployed rental households. But it shows that we have a real debt crisis, right? And what this is still reflecting is the unemployment and stimulus payments that those households receive. These are not households that did not receive those payments, even with that support during those months in between. Even with the higher support of the CARES Act, which gave $600 a month, you still saw this household debt burden increasing and increasing over time. And so there was a paper that came out, I think, late last year from Harvard economist David Schneider, that found that there's been virtually no recovery among poor and low-income households. And the financial fragility, in fact, of these households has increased. And when those microeconomies fall behind, our entire economy is at risk. This graph now shows the projected state budget shortfalls, that were estimated last year. And you can see that from the projected shortfalls from COVID-19 were far greater than anything we had seen in the Great Recession. And that had taken over a decade to recover from, and it was a very uneven recovery. at that. And so while some of these shortfalls have not been as bad as they were originally thought, the policies that kept them from being so bad, are going to expire. It was the unemployment insurance, it was the stimulus checks, the policies that provided direct financial assistance to vulnerable households are both not as high as they were, not as high as they once were, but they're set to expire in a few months, many of them by September. And again, we haven't seen any meaningful debt relief. So, we're precipitating another kind of fall by the end of this year, unless things fundamentally change. And of course, again, just to reiterate, we're going to see deeper racial inequalities. Black, Latino, Latina, Native households have been worse hit by all of this because there were fewer resources to draw from to begin with. After the Great Recession, more than a decade ago, Black wealth was cut in half. And there have been higher rates, as I mentioned earlier, among frontline low wage and essential work among Black, Latino, and Native people. So this isn't, lest anyone tell you, well, what else can we do? Well, this isn't because we have a scarcity of resources. There's actually a great abundance in this country. And some of us have been able, some people have been able to access that better than others. What this chart now shows is the total wealth of US billionaires from 1990 to 2021. So we can see it growing over time, which is one thing to take note, but as I mentioned earlier, before the pandemic, 3 people owned as much wealth as half the country. That's reflected right here in the months leading up to 2020, in the years leading up to 2020. But what this graph also shows is that 1/3 of this billionaire wealth was accumulated during the pandemic. You see this huge jump from under 3 trillion to over 4.5 trillion. Now, at the same time that millions of people are out of work, 500,000 people have died. There's this growing debt crisis, and this relief package of 1.9 trillion that, will be financed in part through corporate taxes and all this. But at the same time that all this has happened, billionaires have increased their wealth by 1/3. And so this is not by accident. This is not because they work any harder. It's through policies, it's through loopholes, and it's facilitated by a political process that actually keeps, poor and low income and dispossessed people, especially people of color, out. So one of the most disturbing trends that we've been following and paying attention to is on voter suppression, which, this is not new. Again, it is the history of this country to have racially targeted laws that prevent access to the democratic process, especially to poor people and poor people of color. But what we see now is that, after 2020, these are the bills that have been introduced in the 2021 legislative session. You could see in every state, basically, except Ohio. And, that may have changed in the weeks since this graph was made. In every state except Ohio, there have been some laws, and in many cases, multiple laws. The darker the state, the more laws have been passed or introduced to suppress voting rights. What happens when every state except Ohio and Vermont, I guess. And so when, what happens with this is when you restrict the democracy, the laws that end up being passed by the people who are put in place through voter suppression have a broader impact on people who may not have been the direct targets of those voter suppression laws. So in the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, they looked at this very closely, and they found that the same people who were restricting voting rights were also restricting immigrant rights. They were, keeping the minimum wage down. They were, fighting. They were pushing back against the expansion of Medicaid. So all of these things were part and parcel of this attack on democracy. And the last couple of things I wanted to share was that, over the past, what this looks like, when you have this restricted democracy, and when you look at this all together, we have been funding law and order much more than we've been funding welfare programs and anti-poverty programs. This is a very recent, this is a graph No, it's not. It's not from 2021. Just to show, the stark divide that's happening as our public spending is going towards policing and prison and courts versus welfare programs. And to disaggregate this a little bit, I realize these graphs are small, but if you just follow the trend lines, it's a little bit all you need to know. The top one shows the decline in welfare spending from the 1970s to the 2000s. And this red line is when welfare reform was passed in 1996. So 1996, let's say, is the mark, and you just see the steep decline in especially cash assistance programs. And under TANF and welfare reform. Then these bottom two, which have very similar shapes, show the increase and rise in both immigration spending and deportations, and spending on border enforcement, and federal spending on prisons and incarceration. And so you see, again, there's this increase going from with these various bumps in deportation and border spending, with the as spending on immigration enforcement increases, so does the number of deportations. Likewise, you see the spike in the early 90s on federal prison spending, which only increases, and as does the number of prisoners. That decline a little bit is due in some part to the efforts of organizing, against by families with incarcerated people. And so, but it's you can't have empty prisons, and so usually an increase in spending on prisons leads to more people who are incarcerated. And so this is the effect of the kinds of policies we have. And over the past several decades, as we've been spending all this money on war, on incarceration, on immigration enforcement, this is in fact continuing even now. So even with this current administration, even though military spending is finally kind of there's actually some, if you compare military and non-military spending, there's a change where we're seeing more spending going towards non-military spending, which is a good thing. But in raw dollars, the Pentagon budget is still greater than it was last year. It's over $750 billion. And so, we know that this is not how it needs to be. There are policies that we can implement that could move us in a different direction. The pandemic is creating an opening to change that direction. And some studies have looked at, so we've seen that if there had been moratoriums in place that on water and utility shutoffs, if we had basically access to water, if we had access to housing and healthcare, we would have not only saved lives, our economy would have been better. We've seen policies that when they're targeted to poor and low-income households, they have a positive economy-wide benefits. And so this graph right here is from the Brookings Institute. They looked at a series of pandemic policies, and the policies had the greatest effect. This highest green line were the programs that gave money directly to financially struggling households. And so every dollar that went to a poor and low-income household was multiplied into $1.20. Every dollar that went into businesses turned into 30 cents. And so, the steep decline is because the report anticipated that those supports would eventually end. But there's a strong argument to be made, and this is, not just among pandemic policies. We see this with food stamps. We see this with living wages. Every dollar that goes into a low wage or poor household gets multiplied into more than that dollar, and that's the direction we need to go. And unless we go in that direction, we will, in fact, all suffer. And so our theory of change in terms of policies is, when we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. We have to end, trickle down tax policies have been shown to have no positive effect on the economy. They've only increased wealth inequality. They've only benefited the wealthy. They've actually not done anything else than that. There was a 50-year study from the London School of Economics that showed that came out last year that showed all of that. So we need to, move to a different economic model. And this is what we're trying to say here, that if we center the 140 million if we, we can in fact lift this economy up from the bottom. And in fact, unless we center the 140 million, we're going to see more inequality, more racial wealth inequality, more gender inequality, which will mean that we're not addressing the crises that are exacting violence on our people and destroying our planet. And so our policy platform begins with the 140 million, not out of a position of charity, but out of our common, survival. And we call it a Jubilee platform. That's a biblical term. It refers to the resetting of society. It's in antiquity, this was an economic program to free the slaves, release the debts, let the land and people rest. And that's what we're claiming today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. And this is what we are organizing for in the campaign. I do have a short video that I can show, and then I will turn it over to you, Sabina. Does that sound good? Okay, and the video should be clear what it is, but it's an expression of what the demands are that we're making in this campaign, and why it is that this is the direction that we are pushing for all of us to move forward together. Let me pull that up. And I heard, if this is too loud, somehow let me know and I'll try to adjust the volume.
Everybody has a right to live, health care, everybody, don't stop.
The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has come up with a series of demands. And I want you to say those demands after I say them.
I know that you are here for the same reason we all are here, to put our elected officials on notice. We demand an immediate restoration of the Voting Rights Act. We demand an end to racist gerrymandering. We demand a reversal of state laws that prevent municipalities from raising minimum wage. We demand a just immigration system. We demand a timely citizenship process that guarantees everyone the right to vote.
We demand an end to military aggression and warmongering. We demand a stop to privatization of military budget and any increase in military spending. We demand a ban on assault rifles and a ban on the easy access of firearms. We demand an end to federal programs that send military equipment into local and state communities. We demand that the call to build a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border be ceased.
We demand a ban on fracking, mountaintop removal, coal mining, coal ash ponds, and offshore drilling. We demand a ban on all new pipelines, refineries, and coal, oil, and gas export terminals.
We demand an immediate implementation of federal and state living wage laws. We demand the right for all workers to form and join unions. We demand equal pay for equal work. We demand a guaranteed annual income. We demand fully funded anti-poverty programs that protects the welfare of us all. We demand decent housing. We demand free tuition. We demand free tuition. We demand equity in education. We demand an end to the resegregation of schools. We demand equitable funding for historically Black colleges and universities. We demand relief from crushing household, student, and consumer debt. We demand the repeal of the 2017 federal tax law. And we demand that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. We believe that everybody has a right to live.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latino, join hands of progressive white, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands. When we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption. When we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law is never taken away from anybody. So I got a question. Are the rejected ready to revive and declare that this land is your land, this land is my land, this land is our land, and together from the State House to the White House, the rejected are going to demand that this nation never give up on being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Everybody has a right.
Thank you.
We could watch that again, but I'd rather turn it over to Savina.
Yeah, it always has that effect. So again, thank you so much to Radius for inviting us here today, to Patricia Weinman and Thea Lucas, and of course my colleague, Shailly Gupta Barnes, and to all the students that have tuned in today, along with, I know some of the fantastic coordinators that we have the pleasure of working with here at the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign. So I'm going to touch on building a movement and the 500 days of fighting forward together that we're embarking on. And of course, in the midst of abundance here in the US, we should not be struggling, like Shailly said, to fight for healthcare, treatment for drug addiction, and housing. We should not have to fight to breathe clean air, find food resources, and to keep ourselves safe from the proliferation of gun violence. And at this time in our history, it's critical that we not only connect these interlocking evils that Shailly just laid out, it is imperative that we build a kind of fusion movement that brings alive the goals, objectives, and priorities across lines of division to shift the narrative and build power. Dr. King spoke eloquently of the importance of building a movement that cuts across otherwise lines that divide us, right? He clearly connected the dots of poverty, militarism, racism in his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967. And for example, just like the 50 years radius history, right, speaks to Episcopal chaplain Mike Bloy and the group of MIT faculty that embarked on the work that evolved really into the Technology and Culture Forum. They had challenged each other and one another. And if I am correct, according to this, they challenged each other to do the work and make decisions that promote justice, human security, and a sustainable environmental future. Today, the Poor People's Campaign has challenged and embarked just on what we are challenging each other today, and that's to build a fusion movement. It's not about left or right, Democrat or Republican. It's about what's right and what's wrong. You do not have to leave your silos to do this, particularly here in Massachusetts, where we launched 4 years ago, the Poor People's Campaign, and today are engaged in restructuring and a renewed momentum to fight and build forward together. We clearly understand that all hands must be on deck to fight these evils, and this is what movement building is. So in the next 500 days, the campaign and all of its national, local, and state partners support faith communities, students, artists, and poor and low wealth and impacted communities will lay out a ground game of 500 days fighting forward together. This coordinated action plan is part of what the national plans, including Massachusetts, consist of. A season of Moral Mondays, which just ended, upcoming trainings for our state committees, congressional resolution leading into the June 21st, 2021, which leads us into the midterm elections and building momentum towards the 500 days fighting together. Now, June 2021, we'll be hosting our National Mobilization March online of low workers, right? This assembly is even more powerful than last year's online march on June 2020. Here in Massachusetts, as we get into STEP, we currently host bi-weekly coordinator committee meetings. We are adding and expanding committees toward open volunteer-based campaign strategic planning sessions. This Thursday, we are looking at our mobilization planning calendar toward upcoming local and national plans to coordinate town halls and regional events, building up to June 2020, which is our mass mobilization into Washington, D.C. And we could go into detail later, but I know that in the interest of time, we want to open it up for questions. But what this means is that you can get involved. We need tech support here, and for more information, please contact our new communications committee, admin and logistics, and we'll put the links in the chat. You can visit us on Facebook and our National Poor People's Campaign webpage, along with the national web pages where you can join individual campaigns. So again, thank you so much to all of my colleagues here and to MIT Radius for having us today. I'll turn it over to Patricia or Thea.
Thank you. You both really challenged and inspired us. Before we turn to questions, I wanted to note you mentioned several times the impact of defense spending, and we will have another presentation next Wednesday at lunch with Dr. Heidi Peltier for any of our attendees who want to dig in a little bit more to that aspect of the national budget. I invite our attendees to add questions to the Q&A. You can find the button at the bottom of your screen. We have a first one from Judy asking, is it true that many academics 35 to 40 years ago predicted the very situation we're now experiencing? Says, if I recall correctly from college classes 40 years ago, many of those academics were maligned and labeled as communists. What patterns do you see in the history of trying to mobilize folks around poverty?
Well, Sabina has a rich history to draw from on that, but I do think that, multiple people have noted, one of the things that we refer to all the time is this, is the contradiction of, that came out of the homeless union organizing that's in our lineage of praying to a homeless man on Sunday and then ignoring one on Monday. Jesus was a homeless person who organized among poor people, and that history of that revolutionary work has been mischaracterized and misused against poor people for hundreds, thousands of years at this point. And so I don't think it's, and similarly, the I'm paraphrasing now, but the quote about how when I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I want to ask why people are hungry, they call me a communist. So these are, these politics are not, they are well seasoned. Dr. King reflected on this. At some point we have to, he said, ask questions about who owns the water, and why do we have to pay for water in a world that's 2/3 water? And so these are all questions that have been raised for a very long time, and we're in a, by and by scholars, by academics, by activists, by people who are organizing against all of these injustices. And we're in a moment now that there's an opening to go past those labels. This newer generations have not, what this the generation, what is it, Gen Z now? I'm sorry, I'm kind of, I've forgotten where we are at, but we've been, 20 years of forever war is what a lot of people know, and an uncertain economy. I remember coming out of grad school and facing the prospect of 3-month unpaid internships, and that really brought myself to question what it was that I'd even learned in my economics classes in grad school, right? I mean, if I was being set up to, what was I being set up to do when the prospects, my very real prospects coming out of grad school was, really deep insecurity from one moment to the next. And so I think those conditions are forcing a whole bunch of questions and asking us to reconsider what we thought we knew, how we thought we understood this economy to work or not work, and seeing more clearly how it hasn't been working for everybody. And so, yes, it is true that many of these, for the people who've been studying, different schools of economics, there's, the post-Keynesian schools and modern monetary theory, all these different theories have taken on a new, have been revived in some way, have been revived more recently as the depths of this crisis have become more clear. We can't hear you, Thea.
Sorry. We also have a question from Ed. The last time the country attempted a war on poverty was during the Lyndon Johnson administration. Do you think that Biden will be able to make more progress under the broad banner of infrastructure?
Sabina, did you want to speak to this? What it would mean to have?
I'd love to. Thank you so much, and thank you for that fantastic question. I just want to point out how over the centuries and the decades, whenever we attempt to organize, that red meat is thrown at us from all angles, and we're seeing that right now being played out within certain aspects of the fight in the parties. But what's right and what's wrong is what we're really aiming to do, and not try to defend ourselves against what opposition has greatly used to divide us, right? Against all aspects of society as we're fighting these 5 interlocking injustices. And we saw the war on poverty play out, right? And today we're faced still with 140 million strong, right? Poor people across this country, which is important in terms of us being here today and gathering and organizing and mobilizing to lift from the bottom. We don't have another day in our lives, right? To wait another 50 years, right? And will it be called Gen X? We don't know. But we don't have another day in our lives. It is our duty right now to organize against, whether it's the war on poverty, to the war on drugs, to address these evils, and to build a movement that speaks to our goals, to shift the narrative, change the narrator, right? And build power among the poor and dispossessed, low-wage workers, and uncover the disgusting, and as Reverend Barber says, the pornographic wealth in this country in the midst of abundance. Jesus didn't even ask for a copay. He didn't ask for a copay. He turned over the money changers, just as we're doing, and exposing the evils of the military budget and where all of our money lies at. And like the National Union of the Homeless and the many hours we had spent, Shailly, at Union Theological Seminary's Poverty Initiative and now the Kairos Center with leaders across this country who are fighting against the state and these evils, we are saying we are only organizing to take back what's ours.
And I would just add to that, you know, it's all, I think what can be achieved under the banner of infrastructure depends on who's at the center of what we mean by infrastructure, right? And so if we had somebody on the Moral Mondays digital program this past, or maybe a couple Mondays ago, Erica, a single mom from Chicago, who is very clear that infrastructure means affordable housing. Infrastructure means, you know, healthcare for herself and her children. Infrastructure, like, so if we center the 140 million, if our concept of infrastructure is informed by the conditions facing poor and low-income people in this country, both we're going to see something different emerge as an infrastructure plan, but it's going to create the kind of resilient and thriving communities and move us away from the kind of sectors and industries that pollute and damage and destroy our communities, both here and abroad. And so, you know, it's not clear yet that the 140 million are being centered in this infrastructure plan. It could be that we're coming closer to being part of the conversation, which is meaningful, but we're going to keep pushing, you know, to be at the center, because again, we know that this is about our common and general welfare.
Thank you. We had a couple questions about, I think, potential fractures within that coalition that you're working to create. The first is, how do we deal with those who refuse to admit that they need help, due to pride, believe receiving help is a sign of weakness and therefore might not join such a coalition?
Well, I can start, Sabina, but I know you'll have more to add. I mean, we've seen in this campaign that there are just tens of thousands of people. So, I mean, our answer would be to build this campaign, to show that people, you know, part of the reason why people refuse to admit they need help is there's this shame associated with being poor or being in the position of needing help. And we have to just break through that narrative that, you know, being poor is not the fault of the poor. Poverty is not the fault of the poor. Poverty is the fault of policies and systems and structures that embed and perpetuate poverty. And that's why, you know, we faced a lot of questions when we called ourselves the Poor People's Campaign. Who would want to identify with that? Well, it turns out millions and millions of people do. Because we know deep down that this is not our fault. We know, and we need to break that isolation in the telling of stories of people like Erica and others who are standing up and showing that this is me, this is my life, isn't this yours? And as people see themselves reflected in this growing movement, I think we'll see more and more people come in our direction to share how they've needed help, why they needed help, despite having done everything that they could to you know, as Erica said, you know, this is not being poor, ain't nothing to do with hard work. She's like, I got, you know, pulling yourself by your bootstraps. She's like, I got my boots, I laced them up tight, and I still fell through. And so we really need to break through those narratives, and that takes building the power of this movement and really profiling and lifting up the leadership of the poor people who are at the center of it.
Yeah, excuse me, my allergies. I totally agree. At the tens of thousands of people that we see every day. If I could just put on my minister's hat for a minute, we talk about this all the time, particularly on the distorted moral narrative, where we find that many people, we know the poor, right? Our folks, our people are very religious, right? Deeply religious. But how do we break through the shame? Because the Bible does speak about the poor, right? It's about the poor, the stories of the poor, right? And how do we break through that narrative, that distorted narrative that in the scriptures that deem and blame the poor for their poverty, right? So those are one of the many breakthroughs that help to shift that narrative, right? And put people from the bottom up into leadership positions to speak on those, on the distorted moral narrative that continues to blame the poverty for their own situation.
Thank you. I have another question. It says, do you think it is worthwhile to be clearer on terms like free tuition or debt relief, because both come from someone else's labor? I think this person is naming attention that if we're not paying for tuition or if debts are canceled, that would be an economic impact on someone else.
Yeah, this has come up, and I think it also, it's why in the campaign we talk about first of all what the effects of debt are on our economy, and how the income that then people are bringing into their homes, they don't go to meeting our needs to the fullest extent, they go to debt servicing, right? But when we lift that up to the next level, when households are encumbered with debt burdens often cities and local governments and then states, that debt burden kind of gets multiplied and across, it flows up or something. And so, so it's important to think of debt relief as actually an economic program that can free people from the kind of from the conditions that keep the economy stagnant, that keep it from growing as much as it should. There have been programs out of, so there have been studies done about what the macroeconomic impacts would be of student debt relief, for instance, and how up to a certain level, you're going to see this massive, given the households that carry this debt, the racial disparity, what would happen if at different levels you wipe that debt out, to the racial wealth gap and how that would change. But also there was a experience in California where some of the bail debt, that the criminal fines that people were under, that were again, causing significant debt payments every month, was lifted. It was a few $1 billion that was lifted, and immediately people were seeing $600, $700, $800 extra in their pockets every month. And what that did, to actually spur economic activity was incredible. And so I think, again, you go back to this notion of, who gains and who benefits from debt and who is disadvantaged by debt. And if your orientation, depending on where your orientation is and your economic policies, it'll be clear what side, which side is better for the, for again, the Commonwealth, the wealth of the nation.
Thank you. I'm not seeing another question in the Q&A, so I'm going to take the privilege of asking one of my own. I was startled by the graph you showed of the huge expansion of wealth just in the last year. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some of the factors that contributed to that billionaire level wealth.
So I can speak to some of that. It's been well documented by other people who are better versed in this than I am, for sure. But part of it actually came from the pandemic relief policies of the CARES Act that, and before. So the Federal Reserve released trillions of dollars before the CARES Act was passed to financial institutions, to corporations, to the wealthy, basically, to kind of keep the economy going. That was in the early months of the pandemic and the shutdown. But then the CARES Act, had another, some 500, $500 billion that was supposed to be going to small businesses, things like that. There was very little oversight on. And then there was just, over $1 trillion, I believe the CARES Act went into. So much of that, went towards wealthy and corporations. So it just was there. There were very little oversight of those resources. They were supposed to be going to like your mom and pop store, and then they were going to publicly traded, wealthy corporations. And so there was very little oversight. But then part of the structure of it overall, with the job losses, so companies like Amazon, they were able to expand their operations but keep wages low and benefit from some of the public supports that were available with unemployment insurance and things like that, to cut hours, to cut some of their personnel. This drop in the low wage worker numbers, that's a benefit to some of these bigger corporations, right, who aren't providing healthcare to part-time, low wage, precarious workers. All of that is coming out of public resources, and those were drained as well. So in fact, I think it's the conditions, again, that of the pandemic that were heightened and magnified through policies that didn't actually, accept that there was great inequality that brought us to that point, and then didn't kind of rein that in. In its first kind of attempt at that, there was an infusion of resources that was directed in some ways towards the wealthy and powerful, and that didn't change until. That really just didn't change. In this latest stimulus, in the latest relief bill, under the Biden administration, there's been a greater emphasis on making sure that poor people are receiving more resources, which is a move in the direction we need to make.
Thank you. We're coming up on 1 o'clock. We need to stop promptly then, but I want to offer one more question from our attendees. How do we frame the idea of common good among rural Americans who've been encouraged to equate common good with socialism? These are people who have strong family values and will help their neighbors, but often cannot see beyond that.
Savina, do you want to speak to the work you're doing? And yeah.
Definitely. I know we're coming up on the time. But I know our siblings in the rural counties are, when we talk about the common good, we're talking about the preamble, right? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of that is encompassed in there, that we must look out for each other, right? To provide, right? And we know that in our rural communities, people are suffering right now from the lack of internet and internet services. And I hope I'm answering this question okay. There are food deserts, right? And other projects and survival projects that are about to happen now. We just got in contact with homeless youth. Last night I was on a phone call. These are youth that are 17, 18, 19 that are homeless, but they're in a drop-in center. And hopefully tomorrow night we'll have a conversation about that in time and help to, provide some mutual aid projects or survival projects so that we can, wrap around and not only, recruit, but to provide the information that is needed to help us all excel, right, and fight against these injustices that are part of violation of human rights. So for the common good, right, we must, go ahead, Shailly.
No, sorry. And we've seen just across the country, one of the reasons that we organize on a state level is so that we're not concentrated just in urban centers. Our state committees are intentionally organizing across the state. And so in Massachusetts, you're going all the way across to Western Massachusetts, and in New York, it's not just New York City, it's Elmira, it's all over. upstate New York. We see this in rural Washington, and we see this in the Midwest. And there is just real resonance when we have farmers and nurses and teachers and people who are standing up and saying, this is the problem we're facing here too. And so I think it's the power of fusion, this model that we have that brings different people together. And it's, you know, we do more and more need to be lifting up these projects of mutual aid and survival. And I think, again, as, you know, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but as things get worse, people never just sit back and accept those worse conditions. They always try to we always try to better our lives. And so we have to provide a ready space and a pull to attract people, right? So this is what we're trying to build in this campaign.
Thank you so much. We so appreciate your time and the insights and passion that you bring. As I began, challenged and inspired and deeply grateful, and grateful too to all of our attendees for joining us for this time. Obviously, there's a lot more to dig into than we can get to in an hour, but it's an incredible beginning. So thank you.
Thank you, Thea. Thanks, everybody.